Today, we will turn our attention back to free agency and look at the upcoming summer for three players who don't necessarily need a full show to discuss their free agency, but we're talking about Terry Taylor, Nate Hinton, and Gabe York, the two-way guys, and Justin Anderson. We'll look at this summer for all three players. Should the Pacers bring them back? Should they not? The pros and cons, and all of that and more on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the West Side Community News. And today, after tons of draft content and a little bit of season reviews, we're diving back into looking ahead at free agency from a couple Pacers players, this time looking at some reserve forwards who merit being discussed in their free agency, but not necessarily need a whole show to break down the situation. So we'll do Terry Taylor, Justin Anderson, and the two-way guys, Nate Hinton and Gabe York, on today's Locked On Pacers podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Pacers your first listen every single day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. So let's dive into free agency for these guys. We'll start with Terry Taylor, and the way these shows normally go is I talk about the pros of bringing a player back, the cons of doing so, and then what I ultimately think will happen. And again, for these guys, none of their situations are complicated enough to merit a full show, so we'll do all of them for one segment, kind of run through the situation. And Terry Taylor up first here, who had a really, really fun first season with the Pacers, going from a full-time G League guy after training camp to fighting his way to a two-way contract and then fighting his way up to a full-time contract at the end of the season. Really, really love those kind of stories myself in general. And it ended up being like a low-key underrated score, 9.6 points per game. But what really made him stand out, obviously, was the rebounding. Over 5 a game at 6'5", more offensive rebounds per game than defensive rebounds per game, which is crazy. I mean, he just has so much patience and poise and expertise as a player right around the rim. And not only is that skill valuable no matter what, but that skill's really valuable when you're 6'5", right? You're in matchups advantages down there a lot, and he's able to get some of those rebounds thanks to his leaping ability over some tall trees and really give the Pacers an advantage with his abilities on the glass. So he was really, really special as a rookie this season. And that's why, if you don't remember, right at the end of the season, with about 3 days left in the campaign, 2 days left, he signed a 3-year deal worth basically $4 million, just shy of it technically, but worth $4 million in total, $600K at the end of last season, and then 2 minimum deals the next 2 years, partially guaranteed next year, and then non-guaranteed in the final year. So the structure of that is really important because his contract in 2022-23, so next season, is not fully guaranteed. It becomes fully guaranteed on July 10th, 2022. So that is in free agency. But that late of a date means the Pacers will kind of already know what they've done in free agency. Like most teams are done really by July 4th, July 6th now at this stage. So they'll know what their situation is. So the reason the Pacers would bring back Terry Taylor instead of releasing him from that partial guarantee, and I should add, $625K of his deal next season is guaranteed no matter what, even if he's cut, right? So he is guaranteed at least $600K no matter what. He's above being two-way eligible if he gets waived anyway. So the reason to bring him back, number one, first and foremost, is he's good. He was a talented player for the Pacers this past season. Good on the glass, good finishing around the basket, developed his three-point shot as the season went along, heady defender, right? Like all these things that make him valuable were very obvious throughout the season. Really bonkers advanced stats on offense, really bonkers advanced stats in general because of that offensive rebound rate at his size. Good true shooting, like just a pretty valuable player for a 6'5" depth piece. If he doesn't even end up being in the Pacers rotation next year, he's the exact type of guy that any kind of young growing team should want as a depth forward on their team. Only 22 years old, doesn't turn 23 till like right when camp starts next year. Pacers offense was 2 points per 100 possessions better with him in the game. Like there are a million reasons for him to play. Fits well with Tyrese Halliburton. It just fits well in Rick Carlisle's system. The pros of bringing back Terry Taylor are a lot, right? He's good and young, and the Pacers are trying to be young and trying to get better, and he fits that bill, especially as he grows into another player. And he was in training camp last year, which was valuable for him, but having a full season with the team, if they have him on the roster next year, also will be valuable instead of going down through the two-way system where you're bouncing around between Fort Wayne and the pro team, and then you're not with the team full time. Even when you get the two-way, there's just a lot to that sort of stuff. As with next year, the full-time season with the team if he's back. Will help him grow a second training camp, a whole offseason to be able to work with his teammates. Right, I already saw him at one fever game, so he's been in Indy at least some this offseason working out with his teammates. So the cons of bringing back Terry Taylor, well, there are not very many, let me tell you. So, when you look at these guys who are on minimum non-guaranteed deals, usually the reason not to bring them back is, if you need to free up a roster spot or free up cap space, you'd move on from the player to get that roster spot or to free up that space. So in Terry Taylor's case, the Pacers are pretty tight with roster spots this summer. So they might have to, in theory, make a tough decision of moving on from like one of, I don't know, Brissett, Washington, or Taylor, the minimum guys to free up a roster spot. I don't think they'll have to, but in a situation where like their dream free agency period is lining up, maybe they have to decide to move on from one of those guys. Well, I don't think it would be Terry Taylor in that case for two reasons. One, I think he's better than Dwayne Washington and a little more valuable at this stage. But two, a ton of credits to Terry Taylor's agency for the way that his contract was negotiated at the end of last season, because he got a lower guarantee in the end of last season, but his going into next season, he has that $625,000 guaranteed on his deal. So if the Pacers do need to free up some cap space for their last signing of the summer to squeeze it all in under the cap, cutting Terry Taylor only frees up under $1 million because he's got that $625K that'll be on the Pacers cap even if he's cut. And that's not the case for some of the other non-guaranteed or team option guys. So the Pacers wouldn't even free up as much money by moving on from him as they would from maybe some other guys that they have the ability to. And I don't think the Pacers will move on from any of these guys, but there aren't really a ton of like strong reasons for the Pacers to move on from Terry Taylor unless they have a slam dunk use for his roster spot and they decide that he's the easiest guy to move on from of their non-guarantees. But I mean, there's no good reason to me for the Pacers to move on from a 22-year-old who has unique skills, was clearly a talented fit in their system last year, and already grew so much as a player just in 1 year in the NBA. And he didn't even spend the whole season in the NBA. He's a player who could grow quite a bit. So for marginal savings in a roster spot, and what's a better use of a roster spot for a team like the Pacers, especially at depth forward, than a 22-year-old talented forward, right? Like there is no reason for the Pacers to move on from Terry Taylor. I'm sort of rambling in this explanation of the cons because there really aren't any, right? And I think the fact that he has over $600,000 guaranteed on his deal makes it even like there's just nothing to say about the reasons the Pacers would actually move on from him. I think his play last year kind of solidified his spot on the 2022-23 Pacers, but the fact that he also has that guaranteed money really pushes it over the top, or close to 100%, unless he's traded or unless, again, the Pacers go through some crazy roster overhaul in free agency and end up needing a ton of roster spots. But that seems pretty unlikely given their resources and given their current situation. So what do I think is going to happen? Right. Well, it's kind of obvious. I kind of just said it a bunch, but I think Terry Taylor will be back on the same contract he signed in April on the team next year. I think he'll be on that $1.5 million guaranteed contract. Probably will play in Summer League for the team and then go into camp and, be that reserve depth forward for them. Maybe he can fight for a rotation spot at some point this season. He earned it down the stretch of last season, ended up earning a starting role for, I can't remember how many games, 5, 6, 7, something like that. Not very many, but enough, because he could play center 3 and 4, right? He's able to play a lot. So if there are injuries next season, he'll be one of the first guys because of that versatility that they could consider at any spot, right? He has a lot of value to what the Pacers were last year because of his skills, because of his positional versatility. And next year, as a 23-year-old with a full season under his belt, with more time with his teammates, with an offseason, he'll be better. So makes all the sense in the world to bring a guy like that back on a minimum contract. That's what I ultimately think will happen, because the other side of the coin, moving on from him to save $900,000, that's not even enough for a guy with 0 years of service on a minimum contract, which is a very dorky cap thing to say. You're not getting anything with that. So unless they're doing the craziest free agency squeeze of all time, I think you can expect to see Terry Taylor on the Pacers next season. And then we'll have to recircle this conversation for next offseason when his deal is once again fully non-guaranteed. Let's move on and do one of these other guys. We'll do Justin Anderson next. He didn't technically finish the season with the Pacers, but he was close enough, and he was kind of in this shuffle. He lost his roster spot to Terry Taylor and Dwayne Washington at the end. If the Pacers didn't need to promote the two-way guys, they probably would have just kept Justin Anderson around for those last 3 or 4 days of the season. He was playing like decent minutes. He started 6 times quietly for the Pacers down the stretch of last season. So perhaps a guy they would consider bringing back. Let's talk about his free agency, even though he didn't finish the season with the Pacers, the pros and cons of the Pacers looking at him for a roster spot and what it could mean for his summer and what he ultimately decides to do. Before we talk about Justin Anderson's free agency, though, I want to tell you guys about Built Bar, who are making the best tasting protein bars ever. I tweeted about Built Bar on the Locked On Pacers Twitter account this weekend, and a couple people replied and said my favorite thing you've talked about on the show, like one of the few things I've bought that you've talked about, because they're awesome. People love this stuff. What is a Built Bar? Well, it's the best tasting protein bars out there. Quite simply, you've got to try them. They're all 100% covered in chocolate, delicious protein bars. The stuff you get in the store, it's like chewy or chalky or just not good. Built Bars are delicious. They taste like candy bars. They come in so many good flavors, so there's something for everybody. You just really got to try them. They have a new brownie batter puff flavor that's really popular and delicious right there on their website. And it's only got 140 calories. It's got 17 grams of protein and only 7 grams of sugar. Very healthy. Very delicious. You can use it as a snack or a meal replacement. I've done both at work. They're very portable. They're just quite frankly great. You got to try them. Go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15 when you check out, and you'll get 15% off your order. That promo code again is LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On NBA Big Board. They're breaking down the draft and all these prospects every single day over on that show. Speaking of prospects, we'll be back on the prospects grind here on Locked On Pacers on Friday. Looking at Jalen Duren from Memphis, a center. I know, unusual for the Pacers, but I think he's quite talented and worth talking about as I run through these lottery prospects in the Pacers kind of range. Let's go back to free agency, though. Justin Anderson. Interesting season to kind of talk about and contextualize, because the first time he joined the NBA this season, he was not on the Pacers. He was on the Cleveland Cavaliers. And then he joins the Pacers for a brief stint during their COVID outbreak in late December, early January. And then he couldn't return to the team, but then he was lighting up the G League, ends up making first team All G League before coming back to the Pacers after earning that, finishes out the G League season with the Pacers. Then the G League season ends, his second 10-day expires, and then the Pacers end up promoting other guys. So it was a wild kind of journey for him contractually this season, but he was awesome in the G League and not as awesome with the Pacers. And that's what kind of makes talking about Justin Anderson's season a little challenging, right? 13 games with the Pacers, 6.8 points per game. That's fine in the role he played, but he shot 37% from the field. The three wasn't falling right. His rebounds were fine. His defense had its moments, certainly, but in general, it never all clicked. But in the G League, he was, again, first team All G League player and ended the season with the Mad Ants at 27.8 points per game, shooting 48% from the field, 40% from three, 7 rebounds a game, 4.5 assists. Like, he was a lead playmaker. He had a nose for the ball, was a good defender down there too. Like, that's a good player. And I don't want to say that the G League means anything amazing or like it's a super obvious indicator of NBA success. But like, if you're the best players in the G League, you are usually NBA quality at least, right? So he is an NBA level player. I think he showed that at times with the Pacers this past season, despite his shot not falling. But it's a low enough sample that you can't, I don't have a ton to say about his general play finishing ability. You would have liked more from him. But like, you remember he had that 18-point game in Toronto where he looked really nice, and I forget how many he scored against Denver, but he looked good in that game as well. He had some solid games for the Pacers this year. He had 18 in their win over Portland as well, right? Like, he had some solid offensive games, and he was kind of known for his defense at times coming out of Virginia. He played good defense for Carlisle in Dallas, and I think that's kind of noteworthy. One, that it was the same coach, but two, pre-Luka, even really now, Carlisle kind of had this rep for a long time of a guy who wouldn't really play young players, but he trusted Justin Anderson with a playoff role as a rookie for the Mavs, right? Like, that stuff sort of matters in the context of what we're about to talk about, which is Justin Anderson's free agency and Carlisle's team having roster spots. So clearly not the player he, was thought to be when he was drafted back in 2015. Not that he hasn't had a good career. He's had stops with a bunch of teams, and he's a fine NBA player. He got back into the league this year after being out with an injury last season, but sort of a lot of twists and turns throughout his career in terms of how good he is, what he looks like he's capable of, how he's growing, and things like that. So the reason the Pacers would want to bring a guy like Justin Anderson back is if you look at their cap sheet, they don't have a lot of roster spots, but they also don't have a lot of forwards in general filling up their team next season, right? They're going to eventually need to bring in some sort of forwards to their team. And I think the idea would be, it doesn't take a genius to think this, they would like to either draft or sign those wings. Like, if you look at the Pacers roster top to bottom, like, Buddy Hield can kind of play wing, but he should probably be more of a guard. And Duarte can play on the wing, certainly. Brissett's probably a better 4 than a 3. Terry Taylor's probably a better 4 than a 3. Like, they don't have really any natural wings besides Duarte. So if they draft a guard, or if they draft, a more interior based player, and then they enter free agency with only 2 or 3 roster spots, they need to use like almost all of them on wings. So if you're Justin Anderson and you're clearly a wing and you can kind of credibly defend wings, something the Pacers have been terrible at for years and years and years, that kind of makes sense as a depth signing, right? Like, not to bash him as a player, he'd be a depth signing for sure. He probably would not be signed to be a rotation player or anything like that. But think back to a guy like Jakar Sampson, who the Pacers signed 2 off seasons in a row to a minimum contract, right? They needed depth at the 4 and kind of some versatility at the 5. And Jakar Sampson could play both of those positions. He fit the Pacer ethos at the time of being really gritty on defense and able to kind of make decisions with the ball and the dunker spot role, especially. Excuse me, just dropped my phone. He had value to the Pacers teams those seasons. That's why the Pacers brought him back 2 summers in a row. I don't think Anderson's as good as Sampson was for those Pacers teams, but in that sort of depth versatility role where you can play 3-4, I wouldn't play Justin Anderson at the 5, but it's not like embarrassing. He's not so short or anything. He's 6'6". For like 2 minutes if they have to do it. They played Terry Taylor at center last season. That could be a reason to bring him back, right? He did have that sort of the sort of skills to be like your 15th guy who can play on the wing. If he's on a non-guaranteed minimum deal, if he's on a half guaranteed minimum deal, that's like a fine use of resources to me. And that's something that the Pacers could in theory pursue. They did bring him in twice this past season, right? They really signed him to 3 contracts this past season. They clearly value him to some extent. They tried to sign him into their org, to their G League squad where he scored a bajillion points. Like, there's clearly some sort of value there. And again, Carlisle has coached him before in Dallas. And what really, really wouldn't surprise me is if Justin Anderson's one of the guys brought in for training camp, right? Because he spent a lot of time with the team last year, showed he kind of fits with what they have, and that he has skills that they could in theory use. Now, the cons of bringing back Justin Anderson, one, this is almost unbelievable to think about because he was drafted in 2015. Justin Anderson is 28, and he will turn 29 extremely early into next season. That's not to say he's old. That's not an old NBA age. I don't want to knock that at all. That is sort of outside of what I would at least consider the Pacers' ideal age range, right? Like, he's right around, Buddy Hield's age, basically. Buddy Hield's a little older than him. Brogdon's a little older than him. But most people are saying, especially with Brogdon, like, even if he's good, he's not necessarily gelling with the Pacers core. Like, Justin Anderson's that age. So that is reason number one to not bring him back. Is if you're trying to build a younger team and figure out, with all your pieces, can they improve? Can they grow and be a part of the next great Pacers team? It's a lot less likely Justin Anderson's going to be that guy. He kind of is what he is at age 28 in the year he's turning in 29. 2, when roster spots are scarce, and he could be the last guy they signed. Like, they actually signed Jakar Sampson, I think, in August one summer, like a full month after free agency started. They don't have a lot of roster spots. Using one on Justin Anderson is not necessarily the most appealing or smart move to jump out at free agency, especially when they have 3 draft picks, they have a bunch of cap space, they have a lot of alluring stuff that they could do. Bringing in a minimum depth wing is fine, but not necessarily the best use of your resources right away. And because Justin Anderson is a guy that you would sign farther into free agency. This is not a knock on Anderson. This is more of just detailing the Pacers situation. But because Anderson's a guy you probably sign on, July 10th or July 15th, could find another home by then, right? So the situation for the Pacers and his age kind of lends to Anderson being more of a guy who they don't pursue but end up with, if that makes sense. And that, he could end up being back, but I don't think he was like so worth pursuing much before that. So, the few roster spots hurts, but as a minimum guy, he could technically always be available. As a wing, that's great. The Pacers could use wings. And he did play well, I thought, besides the ball just not going in the basket. Like, he did actually play well in his stints with the Pacers. To me, at least, the eye test showed that. The advanced stats don't show that. In fact, the advanced stats are funky because he couldn't score at all, but the Pacers' offense was much better with him in the game. And I thought his defense was at least his on-ball defense. His team defense definitely needs work, as the whole Pacers team did last year. But on defense, they were way better with him off the floor. 7 points per 100 possessions better with him off the floor. That's the opposite of what it looked like watching Justin Anderson play and watching the Pacers play. So I don't know exactly how the Pacers value him, but again, there is reason to believe that, Carlisle likes him as a player. He did play really well for the Pacers G League affiliate and gave the Pacers enough skills to squint and say, hey, maybe this guy could be our 15th man wing piece. He was for basically a quarter of the season, right? He was on the team for 30 days in a long season, a little more than that, actually. 30, I can't remember. It doesn't matter. He was with the Pacers for basically like 15 to 20% of their season last year. It's not crazy to me that he'd be back next year on a minimum deal, a partially guaranteed minimum deal. Maybe he's just in for training camp. Who knows? And then goes back to the Mad Ants with a bonus who knows? There are a lot of ways the Pacers could handle it. So I don't know what I would predict for Justin Anderson's free agency. I think that if he gets a guaranteed money offer pretty quick in free agency, even if it's a low money thing with another team, he'll do that. I don't think he necessarily has anything tying him to the Pacers, but I do think it makes some sense if the Pacers can convince him to be around and available, that he could be back with the Pacers as one of their last roster spots, or maybe even an Exhibit 10 who gets a nice bonus to go play in the G League. Let's talk about the two-way guys, the least appealing free agency situations to talk about for a lot of people, but still, all this stuff matters in the grand scheme of your team building. The Pacers don't have Edmund Sumner without two-way deals. That Alex Poitras was played in the playoffs for them, growing off of a two-way deal. Ben Moore grew up off a two-way deal for them. Like that, Terry Taylor, we just talked about him in the open of the show, right? The two-way deals do matter in terms of growing players, and if you can keep them around or develop them, they could end up being a rotation guy for you down the line. And that's why we're talking about Nate Hinton and Gabe York. What does their free agency hold? Before we talk about those two guys, though, I want to talk about BetOnline.net, our partner, to continue to be the number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next season NFL futures, all over at betonline.net, your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. They got the lines up for all the NBA games. Game 5 of Heat Celtics in Miami, 2-2 series, and the Celtics are favored by 1.5 on the road. And I can't blame them. The Heat have only really looked great for about 20 minutes of that entire series so far. But hey, it's a 2-2 series. You can head over to that website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action over at betonline.net, because BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On NBA is the way to go. Hear all about Warriors Mavs Game 4, the leaky roof, what's next in that series, what's next in Heat Celtics, plus other news around the NBA, including rumors, whatever they decide to talk about besides the ongoing playoffs. Two more guys to do free agency for today. Some reserve forward E-types. Gabe York gets extended into the show by default, even though he is not a forward. Nate Hinton and Gabe York finished the season on two-way deals for the Pacers. So I have to talk about a gap in my knowledge before we talk about this conversation. There is a rule in the CBA that a player has to be on a team for 15 days on a two-way deal to be eligible for restricted free agency in the offseason. I was trying to figure out, the Pacers neither of these guys, Hinton or York, were on the Pacers for a total of 15 days this past season. Hinton was at 14 days and York was only at 3. So there's a chance neither of these guys could be restricted free agents. However, because the two-way rules got all tweaked this past season, I don't actually know if that rule got altered or revised in any way. So there's a chance one or both of these guys could actually be restricted free agents this summer. And that would a little bit change the way that I would view Nate Hinton's free agency, maybe not so much Gabe York. So let's talk about Nate Hinton's first, because Nate Hinton, he had an interesting season for the Pacers, right? He was one of the guys, the first guy actually, that they called up when they had a COVID hardship need. He jumped right up from the Mad Ants, who were already in Indy at the time, played in 2 games for the Pacers, put up a fat 0.00000 stat line in those 2 minutes. But he was a guy that was okay for them in the preseason, and then was really solid for the Mad Ants, especially on the defensive end of the floor and as a rebounder, right? His G League stats jump off the page, and there was some kind of hoopla from other G League players on Twitter, like, why didn't Nate Hinton make the all-defense teams for the G League? He did not ultimately do it, but some players, including, I think, Justin Anderson, we're kind of wondering what ended up happening there. He is 6'5", Nate Hinton is, and in the G League, he had 9 rebounds a game and over 2 steals per game. And he also shot 38% with the Mad Ants. Again, like I said, with Justin Anderson, those stats don't always translate, but if you're really good, a lot of times it does mean you're an NBA level player. And Hinton, besides the fact that he played in 2 games for the Pacers this year, even though he didn't do anything in those games, did show, some decent stuff with the Mavs as a rookie. And this, I feel like I'm doing Justin Anderson segment all over again, but clearly a guy Carlisle likes, both from the fact that, his 2 stops in the league for Nate Hinton were with Dallas, with Carlisle as a rookie, and then with the Pacers and Rick Carlisle as a sophomore, but also the way Carlisle talks about him. It's not the typical coach liking a player kind of talk. It's the way he says it, the tone he uses makes it kind of clear that Rick Carlisle is in fact a fan of Nate Hinton, and he did have some nice moments for the Mavericks as a rookie in terms of both having a nice game, and he had a nice 8-point game for the Mavericks, hit a couple threes in the same game, but also as a defender and as an improving athlete. So I think Nate Hinton's an okay player, despite the fact he didn't really get the chance to show it with the Pacers. Again, he only played in 2 minutes. Like, he averaged 18 a game in the G League. So because a couple things are at play here, I got to discuss all of them. One thing that's important: Nate Hinton is still two-way contract eligible. So there's a chance the Pacers could decide to bring him back on another two-way next season, regardless of if he's a restricted free agent or not. There's a chance with both him and York that they play summer league for the Pacers, which could be important in a potential pursuit of a two-way deal for those guys. I think Hinton's good enough to have earned a two-way chance, or at least another chance to be on the Pacers training camp roster, see how he fits with this team and their ethos, things like that. It's well known that he kind of fits with the team, at least in terms of the fact that he played for them last year, and they tried to bring him back after signing him to that 10-day hardship. They wanted to bring him back on the two-way. Like, he clearly is some sort of fit with the franchise, even though he couldn't play in the final two games thanks to health and safety protocols. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Pacers try to bring back Nate Hinton this summer, but I don't think either of these guys, York or Hinton, are worthy of a full-time roster spot at this stage. Maybe if they play well on their two ways next year, the Pacers could find a spot for them on a team or give them the promotion that way. But I don't think Hinton is worth more than a two-way. So if he's willing to take it, if I'm the Pacers, I'd be willing to give it to him. He turns 23 in just about a week, 2 weeks from now, basically, he'll turn 23. That's still young enough for me to say, yeah, you know what, you should be on a two-way and be around our team a little more next year, so we can watch you grow and see if you can be a piece for this franchise. Because I think Nate Hinton does have, kind of a unique skill set as a defender and rebounder type. At Houston, he showed a lot of those skills. There's a reason he's been following Carlisle around the NBA. Like, Carlisle likes his skills. So I think it's possible the Pacers decide to bring him back. The pros would be that they'd get kind of a unique, skilled player who's still young and growing and pretty good. But the cons would be that, he hasn't really shown a ton at the NBA level, and he's already 23. The Pacers really like to go young, and they like to go guard with their two ways. But Nate Hinton is a guard. I think he does fit a lot of the Pacers' MO. There's not a ton of cons with guys that are only worth two-way deals. I don't necessarily think he's worth a minimum. If the Pacers give him a minimum deal, I would consider that a bit of an overpay and a con myself, but perhaps they view him more highly than me. So there's a chance Nate Hinton's back. I would not surprise me at all if he's on the Summer League team, for example, and he's around this team a little more. And technically, he is still under contract with the Pacers, so he could end up in the St. Vincent Center for some workouts and improvement this offseason. Perhaps. We will see there. Gabe York, the other two-way guy who finished the season with the Pacers, he only had 3 days with the team. So perhaps if they completely throw out the rule about restricted free agency, he could be a potential restricted free agent. And if Hinton or him is, the Pacers would have match rights on them if another team signs them to a deal, which seems unlikely, but it's possible. And if that's the case, maybe they want to bring both guys back. Who knows? So Gabe York kind of fits into the Justin Anderson category here of, kind of too old for the Pacers to pursue them as part of the young core, right? Gabe York will turn 29 in August, just made his NBA debut for the Pacers' final 2 games down the stretch of the season. Had some nice moments of burst driving to the basket, right? Had some nice assists, 4 assists and 8 points in 2 games. Did not shoot the ball particularly well. 2 for 7 from the field, although he did hit his only 2-point shot. He took a lot of threes in his 2 games with the Pacers. It was cool to see him get his debut. I don't necessarily view him as an NBA level player, though. His stats with the Mad Ants were worthy of a call up, I think. But in general, like, nothing Gabe York showed at the pro level suggests that he should be, back big time, earning, a two-way deal or something for the Pacers next year. He did score 18 points per game in the G League this past season, but didn't shoot amazingly. He's not like a high-level playmaker or anything like that. So I don't think the Pacers would bring him back. The pros would. I don't know that there's a ton of pros for a 29-year-old guard who is barely NBA level, but the cons are that you're using a roster spot on a guy who doesn't necessarily fit your timeline and is possibly not NBA level. So maybe they really like him. He was one of the better Mad Ants this past season. He was worthy of being called up at the end of the year when he was, but I don't think he's a good enough player, quite frankly, to be brought back, despite, having a very, very cool story of, finally, after grinding his way through the G League, finally getting that pro opportunity, and then to do it against, Joel Embiid, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving in the last 2 games. Very cool for Gabe York. He totally earned the opportunity to have those games, but I don't necessarily think he's someone the Pacers will prioritize and plan on this offseason. So in summary, for the whole show today, I think Terry Taylor is back on the Pacers on his current contract, a minimum deal this year and a non-guaranteed minimum deal next year. Justin Anderson, perhaps the guy they'd bring in for training camp or as their last roster spot guy, though I don't think he can get a fully guaranteed minimum from the team. Nate Hinton, perhaps back on a two-way, and Gabe York, I do not think will be back with the Pacers, but I do not necessarily know what the team is thinking about all of these guys. Thank you guys a ton for listening. If you've made it this far, you get to know tomorrow. 2 more season reviews to go. We'll do one of them tomorrow. I'm calling it the reserve wings, the deep reserve wings. Buddy Hield, who I squeezed into this wing group, Keelan Martin, and Justin Anderson. You get 2 straight days of Justin Anderson talk. Will be coming your way tomorrow. And the only group left of the player season recaps will be Halliburton, Brogdon, and LeVert, saving the best for last, quite literally. And then Friday, like I said earlier, Jalen Duren prospect breakdown as we continue to do most of these lottery guys that I think are worth talking about from a Pacers perspective, just to have the context of all the guys kind of in the mix in that 1 to 12 range in case the Pacers do decide to kind of fly backwards in this draft. Who knows? So thank you guys a ton for listening. Hope you enjoyed today's show, and we will see you tomorrow.